welcome to Listening to Lancaster. I'm Diana Martin with Hourglass, and it's my pleasure to be joined today by Danielle Keperling, Executive Director of the Historic Preservation Trust of Lancaster County. Thanks so much for joining me today, Danielle.
Thank you for inviting me on with you.
I'd also like to thank our sponsors for these episodes, Lap Electric, Landis Communities, and Martin Insurance for their support of Hourglass. So let's jump right in. Danielle, can you tell us a little bit more about the Historic Preservation Trust?
Sure.
What's your mission and how did you get started?
So the getting started story is very interesting. So if anybody's or if people are familiar with downtown Lancaster, and there's the big parking garage on the corner of Orange and Prince, East Orange and I guess that's West Orange because it's past Queen, West Orange and North Prince. They had proposed to tear down the building that is our headquarters in the late 60s in order to build the parking garage. And the community got together and decided that that building was worth saving. And at the time, it didn't look like much. It had been altered significantly. But it was tied to national events. Andrew Ellicott was a famous surveyor. He taught Meriwether Lewis for the Lewis and Clark expedition how to survey in that house. So it got national attention and people worked to save it. So now if you look at the parking garage, you can see they built it completely around the house. So we're in shadow most of the day. But they saved the house, and that spurred people to start thinking about maybe this urban renewal where we're knocking down all the buildings and building concrete structures isn't the best plan for development in Lancaster City, and how could we do better? And that is still our mission. Our mission's not to stop development, but it is to work with people who are wanting to develop things, to do things, to build things that are sympathetic, to try to preserve what is there if at all possible, and then to advocate and help people to preserve the buildings that they have through education.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think it's important to preserve historic properties in Lancaster?
I think that the historic properties and the stories that go along with them, because I think the stories are important. Because they give everybody a connection to that history. There's a book that I read several years ago that I talk about frequently, but it talks a lot. He was a political scientist who didn't realize that he was writing a preservation book, but it talks about collective memory and how if people don't remember the events tied to places, they get forgotten. And because people move away, people die, and then the stories are lost, like within a generation. So you have to keep those stories being told so that people remember the events that are tied to the buildings. But just in general, just from an aesthetic standpoint, I had family from the West Coast here a couple of weeks ago, and we walked around downtown, and I'm like, look in this block, you can see, colonial to modern buildings. There's just a wealth of agricultural styles and details in Lancaster City that are unique to the area and to the East Coast that you don't see in other parts of the country or other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. So I understand you're still relatively new in your executive director role. I think you started back in August,
yes.
Which is right at the same time I started at Hourglass. So welcome to your new role.
Oh, thank you.
I'm curious, how did you personally get interested in historic preservation, and what's some of your experience working in that area?
So I actually, my background's in historic preservation construction. So I started in the construction field in 2001, working for my parents' company. And I joked that I started as a glorified secretary because I really did. Like I had right out of high school, I had gone to culinary arts school. I was working in a bakery. My husband was actually working for my parents for like 3 years before I did, 3 or 4 years. And came home from work one day and was complaining. And my dad's like, I've been waiting for this moment. Come work for us. And so I did. I went back to school. So my educational background is in business. And I learned a lot about preservation. We only work on older buildings. The Preservation Trust had reached out to me to see if I'd be interested in doing preservation consulting for them. And I do that for homeowners and other organizations. So I was willing to do that. And I really enjoyed it. And I got along well with the board. So then last August, they asked if I would be the executive director.
So you have a lot of experience actually working on historic preservation projects. What do you see? What are some of the greatest challenges around historic preservation locally? And maybe, what are some of the resources that are available?
Yeah, I think one of the greatest challenges is, and there's a lot. Education's probably the biggest, and I would say everything, probably all the challenges would go back to education. But I would also say the misconception that preservation is always more expensive. The initial cost might be more expensive, but over time, if you're still using materials that are able to be repaired and replaced rather than, you have to replace the entire unit, it's less expensive overall. And if you're like taking window restoration, for example, if you're restoring windows and those windows have already been there 100, 150, 200 years, and you're just giving them new life by repairing them, they're gonna still be there in another 100 years because those materials are superior to anything that we could put in today.
I think about that. I live in Lancaster City. My house was built in 1840 and it still has the original slate roof.
Yeah.
And it's, how many people can say that they've had a roof on their house for almost,
almost
200 years.
Almost 180. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's pretty remarkable. And
and the one thing that I think, and this is just me on my soapbox, I think that the green building and preservation have a lot more in common than they realize. And talking about like building materials that can be repaired rather than replaced. So if you can just repair a piece rather than taking the whole thing and throwing it away, that's a much greener solution than putting something in that is not able to be repaired.
What's a starting place for people who are interested in kind of preserving some of those things in their home? Are there, what kind of resources do you let people know about?
There's several resources online. There's several places that I know nationwide, not just in the county, that offer classes even for homeowners. There's also the Preservation Trust has our preservation bulletins, which are they were produced probably in the 80s, early 90s, but the material in them is still very relevant. And they're kind of the National Park Service does their preservation bulletins. You can find those online on the National Park Service website. And there's like 50 of them, different problems that people could have with a historic building. So the Historic Preservation Trust put out their own specific to Lancaster, and they're really interesting, showing like different mutton styles, the pieces of wood between the windows or in the sash, and different things that are specific just to this geographic area, where the other ones are more broad because they're more nationwide.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the top projects that Historic Preservation Trust that you all are focused on today?
Well, we have several educational initiatives that we're planning for the fall. And we just finished advocating for the Oregon Village project in Manheim Township. And we do a lot of work behind the scenes. Like we hear about a building that's in danger and we'll reach out to the owners and say, how can we help? What can we do to make this so the building is not going to be lost? So those are the kind of things we do. I'm trying to think if there was if there's been anything. We had earlier this year, we had an illegal demolition of a building in East Cocalico Township. But I don't have anything that exciting right now.
You mentioned the Oregon Village project. For anyone who's not familiar, the Historic Preservation Trust has been petitioning the Manheim Township commissioners to consider the historic resources at that site. And just recently, the commissioners actually voted to deny the development zoning application. What was your reaction to that news?
Well, I actually was surprised because they had approved it 4 years ago. So one of the homeowners took it upon herself and spent a lot of money, I'm sure, because I've paid legal fees before, and sued because they did not take into account her historic property. And so then it got sent back to the commission the commissioners to be redecided. And like I said before, the Historic Preservation Trust is not against development. There's that property across the street that was the old Shawnee Hotel, and that's been vacant for years. That is ripe for development. I think that they should develop there. But the village of Oregon, which is probably the first settlement in what is now Manheim Township, is still like a little village with a crossroads. You can still see the pathways that people took, 200 years ago. And it's one of the last ones in the county. So we were advocating for them to take into account the historic nature. And part of their ordinance also talks about the agricultural character of Manheim Township. And I saw in the paper, I think it was last year, that they're projecting that Manheim Township is going to be fully developed in 10 years. Well, that tells me that they're not really following their zoning if they're supposed to take into account the agricultural character, but they're going to be fully developed in 10 years. But so that's what we were wanting them to. We wanted them to develop some, but we wanted them to also take into account that there are historic properties. I think there's 18 that are eligible for National Register listing, and and there's some archaeological sites, and there are some properties that are listed on the National Register. We just wanted them to take into account in the development plan to, it's one thing if a building is saved. But if it's in the middle of a development, it kind of loses its context. And you see that a lot. You'll see that you drive into a development. I know Bent Creek has one. In the back of Bent Creek, there's a stone farmhouse. That was the farm. That was the farmhouse that all that land was developed from. And you save the house, but are you saving like the context of what was there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess having a golf course around it was probably a little different than when they built the farmhouse originally.
Right. Yeah.
It does bring up an interesting point around historic preservation. I think so many of us in Lancaster are trying to figure out, how do we continue to grow as a county and be prosperous, but also preserve the things that makes Lancaster unique. So our natural lands, our farmland preservation, our historic buildings. So when we look at something like the Oregon Village development, how should we think about, growing densely in our, what they're calling urban growth boundaries?
Right.
So, there's the Places 2040, the county's comprehensive plan. How should we think about growing densely in areas that have infrastructure while still maintaining farmland and historic preservation? How do you guys think about those issues?
And I struggle with that personally. I sit on the Lancaster City Historical Commission. So we approve or deny. I guess we don't approve everything. We review all the new building in Lancaster City within the historic district boundaries. And so far, most of the developers have been coming with buildings with lots that are empty or just about empty. Mm-hmm. There's been a few that they wanted to demolish, and that's not typically allowed without some extraordinary circumstance. But I struggle with it because the mandate, we'll call it the mandate, is to build smart, to build dense, build high density. But I struggle with that, like in the middle of a city block where all the buildings are 2 or 3 stories high, and now you want to put something that's much taller, and it's going to crowd those historic buildings. I struggle with that from just myself. Like I feel like massing and those things are important, but then you can't do both. And so that's like the trade-off. Like, we try to when I'm talking to the architects that are presenting, I usually will ask, can you step back the upper stories at least so it doesn't feel so, you still have the height because they're allowed the height in the city, but it doesn't feel so imposing on the streetscape, those kind of things. And I don't know if that's the right answer or not, but I don't think we can stop the development. So let's try to make it smarter. Not just dense, but make it work within the context that it's in, but and to take into account the buildings that have been there before. Because honestly, those buildings will probably be there after these buildings are gone too, because the way we're building now is not as durable as what was built 100 years ago.
Can you think of a local either development or historic preservation project that you feel like was just really well done, that's maybe a model that we could look to as we work on future projects around the county?
That's a good question. And it was not the intention going in, which is one of those things that like sometimes things come out better because people work together. I mentioned that I had my family here from the West Coast. I took them into the convention center and showed them how they built around the Montgomery House and the Stephen Smith sites. And that just amazed them. And I said, and the original plan was just to knock them down. And so I think is a well done, marrying the new with the old and showing what makes Lancaster special, because you could go to any place in the country and see, these modern buildings that they're proposing. They all look the same to me. They do. Like I don't know what that texture metal stuff is, but it's all over DC. Like you could go anywhere and see it. So like, it's not, but what, how many places have, a oval backed building in the middle of their convention center? I can't think of any other ones.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that project. So you mentioned a little bit earlier the National Register of Historic Places. Can you just, for anyone who's not familiar with that, just talk about what that is and kind of how you determine if a structure is historically significant? What are you looking for?
So, what I look for is probably different than what the Park Service looks for. But so the National Register of Historic Places is administered by the National Park Service. It's through the State Office of Historic Preservation, our Pennsylvania office, but then they send it up to the national, and then it comes back down. But it's an application process. You have to show that your building was over 50 years old. A site of either a historic event or exceptional craftsmanship, architecture. And then there is another category for I can't now I used the word just not that long ago, when you dig up stuff.
Oh, like archaeology.
Yeah, archaeology.
Yeah.
I was trying to,
I got you.
All I kept wanting to say was agriculture. And I'm like, that's not the right word. But and so those are the primary, criteria for being listed on the National Register. The common misconception though is that it's a protection for the building, and it's not. It's just saying that it's nationally significant. Buildings on the National Register can be demolished. The only thing that protects a building is an easement or local ordinances. Those are the two things that will protect a building. Then what do I think makes a building? I was trying to remember what the second part of the question is. So I will do, as part of my work with the trust, I will do demolition reviews for different townships. And when I go out to do that, I typically look to see, how much of the historic fabric is still there. Like, what are we going to be losing if the building gets torn down? And I guess that kind of goes back to education, because, it's like a death by 1,000 cuts. You slowly take pieces of the historic building away, and then all that's left is an old building. And it's not what makes it special. Slowly you take the doors, the windows, you cover everything in vinyl, all when you start to lose that historic fabric, I think that's for me what makes a building historic is the retention of as much of the original as possible.
Mhm. So you mentioned one thing that, can protect a building is either the easements or local ordinances. I imagine that's super complicated in a place like Lancaster County where we have 60 different municipalities. They all have different, zoning and ordinances
Right.
around historic preservation. How do you work with some of those local municipalities on policy? And, is there an ideal policy or ordinance you'd like to see every one of them adopt?
Yeah, it's interesting because they're all very different. Some have very strong ordinances like Lancaster City or Strasbourg. Columbia does too. But then others, they don't even have demolition review. So if you wanted to demolish a building in I can't think of a township off the top of my head, but I know there are some that don't even have a review process. You can just do it. And then there's, the ones that are in between that at least review. Most of the ordinances I would say in Lancaster County have some sort of review. And then they usually look at a historic building as either being listed on the National Register, included in the Historic Preservation Trust surveys. We did a countywide survey about 30 years ago, or deemed historic by a historic preservation professional. And those buildings at least get a little bit more scrutiny before any changes or any demolition can be made to them. It's not perfect. We do have townships that work really well with us that will call us. They'll have us review things. I'll go out and do a demolition review. And then there's other townships that sadly don't even follow their own ordinances. They're really pushing for development. And so our goal, one of our strategic goals we had when we had our board retreat this spring was to work on educating the municipalities on how we can help them. And so we are planning a preservation summit in September. And the day portion will be focused on municipalities and we'll have different speakers. And then the evening, we're going to invite the different historical societies and other preservation minded people in to get a different sampling of preservation education from us.
That'll be great. So when you work with those municipalities, like at the summit this fall, what outcome do you hope to see from that? What will you cover with them and kind of what do you hope will come out of it?
We're going to work with the State Office of Historic Preservation, which ours is called the Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission. And we will help them to see what resources are available for writing the ordinances and what we can do to help them follow the ordinances. And we're also going to really push on how preservation can be good for the economy and good for communities. And that I think that's like something that people don't think about. And so that will help. That'll help. It kind of helps the reluctant preservationists to realize that there is value in it. It's not just trying to stop progress.
I think it's probably the city of Lancaster and Strasbourg and Columbia all have historic districts. Yeah. How does a historic district differ from maybe just a historic property? Does that give any more protection?
It does. So in the existing building code, there's a definition for a historic property, and one of them is either in a historic district or listed on the National Register. So you get extra leeway if you're either in the historic district or listed on the National Register. So it's almost like a blanket National Register for all of those buildings, rather than having to list each building individually. So it just kind of gives it's not as, I guess it gives you some options when if you have a building inspector who wants to make you change the swing of your front door, or because now our doors need to swing out and our older doors swing in. the staircases are usually an issue, but the existing building code allows you, as long as it's a safe condition, allows you to continue using it as long as you don't change the usage of the building. There's lots of triggers, but it's something that allows the historic nature of the building to be preserved while still working within the modern codes.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier that one of the ways you're working with municipalities around education is helping people understand that historic preservation can also bring, economic prosperity to communities. How do we engage our maybe rural Lancastrians with historic preservation who, might not see the same benefit of tourism as Lancaster City or Strasbourg? So in what ways do you kind of work with, folks out in the rural part of the counties to see benefits to them around historic preservation?
Well, I think that over countywide overall that Lancaster is becoming a tourist draw, but most people still associate Lancaster County with the rural plain communities, and they are definitely a tourist draw. But I one thing that, if we're looking at like agricultural preservation, is that oftentimes once a farm stops being an active farm, the insurance companies encourage the outbuildings to get torn down because they're liability on the property. And so we're losing barns and that kind of that scape, that's the scape of the rural farmland with the barn and the house and the working farm. And so I think that working with people to understand how they could either reuse those buildings or keep them keep them in a safe condition so that they aren't a liability, I think would be beneficial to everybody, because I do think that the rural areas are also people come from all over to visit those too. It's part of the history of the area.
Is there any way to track how Lancaster County is doing with historic preservation? How do we compare to maybe other counties?
I don't know that answer. That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm just curious if do you feel that we're losing a lot of historic properties at a
I think it's municipality by municipality.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of one municipality that is really just in development mode, and there's buildings getting torn down all the time. But then, others are much more conservative and want to retain what they have. So I think it really depends. I don't think we could do like a whole county-wide. We could probably go municipality by municipality.
Okay. So what are 3 historic structures in Lancaster County that you wish everyone in our community knew about?
Oh, and you sent that over on the list. I was like, oh, this is a good question, and I had to think about it. So I already told you my one, the Montgomery House and the Stephen Smith sites, and then there's a farmhouse in the Susquehannock State Park in southern Lancaster County. It's, as you drive into the park, it's right there on your right hand side. I went through there because they were wondering how to stabilize it because there were squirrels and things getting in there. It had people living in it until the 50s. It never had a bathroom or a kitchen put in. It's like exactly how it was built, like in the mid 1800s. So I just think that's really cool because you don't hardly ever see buildings that have never been, touched. So the only thing they changed is at one point they put like a coal stove in, but other than that, it doesn't have a bathroom. So, and then I really like outbuildings and like weird things. So my other kind of excitement that I had earlier this year is I went and toured a house in East Earl, and so the other end of the county, and they so in the north and in Lancaster County, slavery didn't have like outbuildings. It was mostly like living above like the summer kitchen or in the house, but like separate. So I walked to the back of the house, and they actually had their washer and dryer hooked up right beside the walk-in fireplace. And I'm like, this is interesting. And then we walked up these stairs that were almost ladders, like it was so steep. And then upstairs, there were 2 rooms that you could tell had been like sleeping quarters. And I was so excited because nobody had touched the back of this house, like except to put the washer dryer. And I'm like, I had never seen that in Lancaster. I've seen like above summer kitchens and things, but I never, so that was my other excitement. But so that's a private residence though. So I don't think we can get tours for everybody to see that.
What about, is there a particular architecture style that is prominent in Lancaster that you wish more people in the community knew about?
That's prominent in Lancaster. There's a lot of Victorian in Lancaster City. And it comes with its own challenges because it's so ornate and, so much to go wrong. But I think that with a little bit of education, people could maintain those and keep those decorative features. Personally, I have a soft spot in my heart for mid-century modern. So I drive down Columbia Avenue and I look at like the synagogue there at President Avenue, and then the dry cleaners after Stone Mill Plaza. And I'm like, these are all buildings that need to be documented. So that's my when we do our next countywide survey, I want to include some newer buildings in that.
Are you working on another survey?
It's on our like 3-year plan.
Okay.
So I joke that, and it's really not a joke, but it's funny, that our survey was last completed when I was in middle school. So we need to update it.
And what do the surveys entail for anyone who's not familiar with that?
So it's the basis for what the municipalities use to determine what's a historic property unless it's on the National Register. And they sent out volunteers, the trust sent out volunteers to go through every municipality and take photos and document properties. And I can, looking back, I'm sure at that time they felt like they did a lot of good work, which they did. But looking back, I have like a couple issues with the survey. There is a definite bias against like early 20th century. And I think that's just because like most of the people doing the survey had lived through it and they didn't think it was special. They like in Columbia, we have like, I forget how many binders of Columbia we have, because whoever was the volunteer for Columbia took pictures of every single building in Columbia. But the person who was in charge of Lancaster Township just took pictures of Schooling Hills, and that was it. So like, there's no rhyme or reason. Like, so we just need to do a better job and like better train the volunteers. Everybody can't just go out and do their own thing.
So when you do this again, it'll be a county-wide survey, and you'll document is it just the historically significant properties?
Well, it's and that'll have to be a discussion because 50 years is usually the cutoff for historic property. So then that takes us into the 70s, maybe by then, getting into the early 80s. And my math is bad. No, it would still be the 70s. But it would be, so like, we'll have to debate, like, do we need to document every like 1960s development with split levels? But there are definitely properties that are unique and special that probably should be preserved from that time period. So it'll be a discussion. I'm sure there'll be some disagreements. Yeah.
Well, what are some of the ways that if people are listening to this, they could get involved with the Historic Preservation Trust? I know you guys have tours and events.
Yeah, we do. We're open most first Fridays. And we have pop-up art shows every first Friday, usually a different artist. That's at our headquarters at 123 North Prince Street. I mentioned the Preservation Summit earlier. We're focused on the municipalities and the historic societies, but really anybody who's interested in preservation is welcome to come. That's going to be September 30th at the Ware Center. And then we're having a Lancaster City architectural tour featuring the building designs of C Emblem Urban on October 15th. And we're having a Halloween party, the All Hallows Gala, on October 29th. I during our event committee meeting thought that they were saying All Hallows Gallows, and that's what I wrote down, and they're like, no, that's not what we said.
I love that.
Yeah.
I know we didn't even talk about Emlyn Urban in our conversation today. I don't know. I'm curious offhand if you know how many property or how many
we were
things has he
talking about that.
designed in Lancaster.
Yeah, Greg Scott, who's an architect from and he writes an article in the paper. He is really researching and writing a book about him, and he said that he's up to over 400
Wow.
properties that he designed in the city, and I guess around the county. And also and I'm not an architect, so it doesn't seem like I don't understand what makes it special, but he was saying that it's pretty exciting that he designed in so many different types, architectural styles. So we're excited to have that tour, because we did do a similarly themed tour about 12 years ago, but now there's been so much more research done. So we're excited to present that again for everybody, and and we're going to have different properties open that were not open before too.
That'll be great. I'm looking forward to joining that. Was there anything I didn't ask about today that you wanted to share with our audience?
Not that I can think of. Thank you for having me. Oh, if you did ask how people could get involved too. If anybody's interested in volunteering, we're looking for volunteers, and we're trying to be more present in the community and be out more. So if anybody has any concerns or questions or sees anything that they're not sure about in their neighborhood, feel free to reach out. We get those calls all the time. That's how we found out about the building being illegally demolished. A neighbor called. So we can't be everywhere. So it takes everybody to look out.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Danielle. For everyone who's watching, you can find more episodes of Listening to Lancaster on our YouTube channel or our website. That's hourglasslancaster.org. And I really appreciate learning more about historic preservation today, and hoping to join some of those events this fall.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.